While Childers' testimony is not as explosive as other witnesses that have taken the stand in this case, he would show that Judge Hargis could and would threaten potential eyewitnesses. The defense attorneys would have none of it and would immediately rise to their feet, screaming objections to the Childers' testimony. Would it work? Or will his testimony be able to stand to be said as part of the court record? Come along with us as we sit in on the testimony of Hardin Childers concerning the shooting death of James Cockrill. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Hardin Childers testifies. The next witness to be called on the stand would be Hardin Childers. This witness was only 150 yards from the courthouse when all of the events in this case took place. According to the newspaper, the Breathitt County News, Jackson, Kentucky, April 25, 1905. Quote, Hardin Childers, the next witness, had lived in Breathitt County for 12 years. Was about 150 yards from the courthouse when the shooting of Cockrill took place. Went to the courthouse and saw Elbert Hargis, Jet, Britton, and Jesse Spicer. Unquote. So, Childers is testifying that he saw 4, not 3 men together when he went to the courthouse. We do not have a statement from Childers that he actually witnessed the shooting or who he witnessed in the window. He also did not state what the men were doing when he saw them together, only that he saw them. Now, this possibly could go along with the previous witnesses who also saw the men together. But because he saw them, he would run into trouble with Judge Hargis. This would get a huge reaction from the defense team. Defense team on their feet. While the article written by the Breathitt County News does not give us very much information about the actual shooting of James Cockrill, it does give us more information about the threats, fear, and control that the Hargis faction would hand out to the citizens of Breathitt County if they dared to give statements against them. Continuing along with the Breathitt County News article, quote, witness said he got a message from James Hargis a few days after the shooting. But at this instance, attorneys for the defense were on their feet, objecting to the witness, telling the nature of this message. But after Colonel Allen had explained what he intended to prove by this witness, the court ruled that it was competent. Unquote. We will find out what the message was in a moment. But evidently the defense felt that it was prejudicial or harmful to their case if the jury heard the testimony about the message. Colonel Allen would have to explain why this message was important to the case and why it needed to be allowed in as evidence. Evidently, the judge agreed with Allen and decided to let the evidence into the trial and overruled the defense objections. But we have to note something strange here. How was the message delivered to Childers? Did it come in the form of a note, a letter, or did a person deliver it from Hargis? We are not told how it was delivered, but only that it was. And why would a message be sent instead of Hargis himself confronting Childers over what he thought was being said about him? In other testimonies, we see that Hargis had no trouble coming up to people to intimidate them into potential silence. This seems like an odd behavior on the part of Hargis to handle Childers in this manner. The message. There are a couple of strange things to notice in this message. Notice that the timeline of when Childers moved to Jackson and the trouble that Hargis and Childers had doesn't line up. Also, notice what Hargis was accusing Childers of doing and what the consequences now will be. Continuing on with the Breathitt County News article, quote, he said the note stated that he, Childers, had better walk straight and not cross the path of Hargis, that he had been in the way of Hargis for 15 years, that Hargis was tired of being accused of murdering people, and that it was time for the witness to get out of the county, unquote. Was this a threat? Was Hargis telling Childers that he had better leave Breathitt County, or else he would meet the same fate as Cox, Cockrill, and Markham? And what did Hargis mean by the statement that Childers had been in the way of Hargis for 15 years? The witness claims that he had lived in Breathitt County for only 12 years at that point. What went on 3 years before he had moved to Jackson that caused him to get on the bad side of Hargis? Did he have political influence? Or was he simply not going along with Hargis and what he was doing in Breathitt County? Was Childers accusing Hargis of killing people? Was he spreading rumors? This we cannot say for sure, but we sort of gather from the reading of the witness statement that Hargis certainly thought that he was. Meeting man to man. Childers testified that he was not about to let this threat stand. So, instead of getting out of town, Childers went to Hargis to confront him over the message. He wanted to make sure that he actually sent the message, and if he did he mean what it contained? Continuing on with the Breathitt County News article, quote, Childers said that he went to the store of Hargis and asked him if he had said and meant what was in the message. And Hargis said, quote, yes, by God, I said it, unquote. Childers told Hargis that he must be mistaken about reports alleged to have been made by him. And Hargis told him that perhaps he was, and if so, he was sorry. Witness said that Hargis told him that he did not like Cockrill and was a friend of the man who had shot him, unquote. So, the two men hashed out their differences, and Judge Hargis even apologized for the mistake. However, we also get another clue that Hargis drops to Childers, that the man who shot Cockrill was his friend. This was a huge clue that Hargis was on the side of the killer, and that Childers better watch out and watch what he said about him from now on. Now, friend in feuding language can mean a couple of things here as well. Friend can mean just that, a friend. Or it could mean that he is part of my faction and under my protection. Also, it could mean, I ordered the killing and you better not say anything about it. Also, it could mean that the Hargis faction didn't have anything to do with it, but they still approved of the actions of the person who shot Cockrill and would defend him if need be. But there is something else that stands out to us about calling the shooter a friend. It meant that Hargis knew who was behind the shooting. Whether or not he actually ordered the killing, he had knowledge of the person who did it. The testimony of W. Vaughn. The first witness of the three to take the stand was attorney W. Vaughn. He was the acting attorney of Thomas Cockrill during his bail hearing for the shooting death of Ben Hargis. There was not a lot of information that survived concerning the testimony of W. Vaughn. But let us walk through what remained and see if we can piece together what he said through the testimonies of others that he verified. According to the article written in the Breathitt County News, Jackson, Kentucky, April 21st, 1905, quote, on Wednesday morning, W. Vaughn went on the stand and, among other things, corroborated Ance White as well as Charles Terry about the maneuvers in the courtroom during the hearing of the application for Tom Cockrill for bail. Charles Green and James Blanton testified to the same facts in the former trials, unquote. Okay, so let's recap here. We do know that Ance White did testify that there was a plot to kill 5 men, Dr. Cox, Jim Cockrill, Mark Cockrill, Attorney Vaughn, and another, at the court bail hearing of Thomas Cockrill. Tom Cockrill was in jail for a barroom shootout he had with Ben Hargis, who was shot and killed. Ance White agreed to his part to help his brother, Tom White, to get out of prison for first-degree murder of James Markham. This plot failed because of the actions that were taken by a deputy to calm the situation down. While Vaughn did not know the details of the plot to kill him, he was able to testify that there was a huge uproar at the court hearing and the actions of the people that were taking during that time. We can safely assume that he gave statements concerning this viewpoint of the happenings that was happening at the hearing, even though the court records have been lost to time. The testimony of Daniel Bush. The next witness on the stand was Daniel Bush. He is also another new witness in the case that we do not have previous testimonies to glean from. However, we do find it interesting that he was offered his job back as town marshal as a form of a bribe in this case. Returning to the article written in the Breathitt County News, Jackson, Kentucky, April 21st, 1905. Quote, the next witness, Daniel Bush, was formerly a deputy town marshal of Jackson. Said that about 10 days before the killing of Cockrill, he met Jim Hargis on a bridge at Jackson, and that Hargis asked him to assist in the plot to get rid of Cockrill. Witness says that he refused to have anything to do with the plot to kill Cockrill. Witness says Hargis held out the position of town marshal of Jackson if he would do the work, unquote. We do find it interesting that Hargis went to a former lawman to ask him to be an assassin. Was it because Bush had nothing to do with the breaking of the law that he refused? Or how about he refused on the grounds to be a hired assassin for the Hargises, which meant that the Hargis faction would essentially control him for the rest of his life? Either way this was, and there are several more possibilities here, Bush said no, and was willing to testify to all that was said on that bridge in Jackson. The testimony of Daniel Bush concluded all of the information that was available in the April 21st edition of the Breathitt County News. The testimony of Moses Feltner. The end of the article we have just stated did not end the coverage of the trial. The coverage of the trial would continue the next week. Moving on to the next week's edition of the Breathitt County News, Jackson, Kentucky, April 28, 1905. Quote, Moses Feltner was put on the stand Wednesday afternoon and occupied all the afternoon and the entire day Thursday, giving his testimony, which was pretty much the same as given in his famous deposition given at Winchester a few months ago, unquote. This one would be pretty easy to go back to. We will only briefly recap what Feltner has already stated in other courts of law. First, Feltner would most likely recount his testimony concerning the plots to kill Markham and Cockrill, how the men would meet in the Hargis store office at night to discuss who should die first and how. He also spoke of the placement of weapons and who all was involved in the plots. Mose Feltner was also one of the men that was bribed to leave the area during the Markham damage case. It is believed that his damaging testimony would land everyone in jail. He first gave his statements through the affidavits given to the court before he started appearing in person. His testimony was a pivot point for several of the accused to be found guilty of the contempt of court and having incurred jail time and or fines. Other newspaper stories. What other reports were saying about these testimonies together? And if Moses Feltner was a 2-day testimony, why did they put his testimony with the other 2 men? We see in several of the other newspapers the following statement almost word for word. According to the article found in the Interior Journal, Stamford, Kentucky, April 21st, 1905. Quote, in the Hargis trial at Lexington, Mose Feltner again detailed the alleged plots to take the life of Cockrill, while Dan Bush, a new witness, said that Hargis asked him to assist in the murder of Cockrill. Bush is serving a term in the penitentiary for horse stealing. W. Vaughn, a former attorney of Jackson but now of Oklahoma, also gave damaging testimony against Hargis, unquote. Even though we do not have the complete testimony of the men and the court records cannot be found currently, we can surmise that the defense team is not too happy with the proceedings thus far. Even the newspaper reports are not looking for a favorable outcome to the cases. But there is more testimony to come and more twists and turns as the trial continues. Peters' location. Noah J. Peters was called to the stand and sworn in. The first bit of testimony that he gives to the court has to do with his location and what he saw at that point. Quote, on Friday morning, the first witness was Noah J. Peters. He said that he was standing about 10 to 12 feet from the front door of the courthouse when the firing began, and immediately stepped into the corridor of the courthouse to get out of range of the shots, as he could not tell from just what point that they were being fired. Saw the people at Cardwell Corner scatter, and believed that someone was being shot at, unquote. In a moment of sheer terror, not knowing if he was the target or not, he bolted for the courthouse door. All he was able to see in that moment was people scattering and hearing bullets flying. His main objective at that moment was to get to safety fast. This is a very normal reaction in moments of extreme danger. Our flight or fight instincts kick in. It is a moment of react first, think later. We are pretty sure that when he went inside of the courthouse, he went straight to the safest place he could find, as quickly as he could find it, to get away from the shooting. What Peter saw inside of the courthouse. It took a minute or two for the bullets to stop being shot from the guns. It was at that point that the target, Town Marshal James Cockrill, lay on the ground in the middle of the street. After calming down, Peters then reports what he saw in his surroundings from his position. Quote, saw no one when he first entered the courthouse door, but after a minute after the firing ceased, he saw Kurt Jett come down the rear steps and cross the street towards the Hargis store, unquote. At first, Peters was unaware of what he had just witnessed. Because he was not aware of where the bullets had come from, the possibility of Kurt Jett being one of the shooters did not immediately come to his mind. This could have been because he was still upset by the events going on around him and had not fully recovered his mental state yet. However, Peters did have the presence of mind to follow Jett's movements to the Hargis store. Jett goes to the Hargis store. Peters places possible shooters at the location of the Hargis upper room. Peters might not have been aware of the importance of what he witnessed. Or there is another possibility that he had not placed everything together yet. However, he is not the first witness to state that there were other men with guns in this location. His statement about these men does back up the other witness statements concerning the Hargis store upper window. Quote, witness looked in the direction of the store and saw Jim Hargis and Ed Callahan at the window with guns. Said he saw King Ford standing just behind them, but could not tell whether Ford had a gun, unquote. Something very interesting here. Even if the men were standing in the window with guns, did they shoot at Cockrill, or did they come running with their guns in case they were needed for other reasons? Was the window open or closed? If the window was open, it could make sense that these men could have possibly also been shooting at Cockrill. However, if the window was closed and unbroken, then the men were innocent of this. We do find it interesting that neither the prosecution nor the defense asks any witnesses this very question. Could this be because the event of the shooting took place on July 20th, 1902? So, the window could have been opened to let heat out of the building? And because this answer was so plausible, that it might have been the reason why this question was never asked? Scene back at the courthouse. Jett returns once again to the courthouse. We do not know why Hargis told Jett to guard the back stairway to the upper floor. Was it because this was the only stairway that granted access to the room that the shooters used? Was this so that no one would go up there to tamper with evidence for the investigation? Or was it to make sure that no one would be recognized coming out of that room? While we do not have answers as to the request, we can speculate that there had to be a reason behind it. Quote, said he heard Hargis say something to Jett, and the latter recrossed to the courthouse after going as far as the store door. Hargis told Jett to go back and guard the courthouse door, and that Jett replied that the door did not need guarding. Also saw Britton and Spicer near the door when Jett returned. Saw Britton and Elbert Hargis near the store just before the shooting, and saw Hargis and Callahan talking to them, unquote. So, why wouldn't the courthouse need to be guarded in Jett's opinion? Was it because all of the shooters had been vacated from the room by this point? Jet was seen coming down the stairs by several witnesses. If he was one of the assassins, then why didn't he make his exit from the room more secret? It seems that he felt that his family connections would protect him and that he could basically get away with anything. We are speculating about this, as there was not given any reasons why Jet gave this reply. While this would end the testimony that Noah Peters would give in this trial, all of the testimonies that he would give combined would lead him to fear for his life. Peters goes on the run. At first, when we came across these articles, we were a bit surprised. The last of the Hargis trials would take place around October 1905. After the final verdicts were handed down, did Peters feel that it would be more prudent to disappear? According to the article found in the Breathitt County News, Jackson, Kentucky, January 19, 1906. Quote, Noah Peters, who went to Central America several months ago to engage in the logging business, returned about 2 weeks ago, unquote. Now, at first we took this article at face value. Peters literally left the country for a business opportunity for a few months. But this also could have been a red herring so that the Hargis clan would not know where to find him. How do we know this? By the second article written about him just 2 weeks later. According to the article found in the Breathitt County News, Jackson, Kentucky, February 2, 1906. Quote, Uncle Noah Peters is hustling around now and making ready for another wild goose chase. He is going to Washington this time, he says, unquote. So, if we take this article at its face value, we get an interesting picture of what was going on in the life of Noah Peters. He was trying to lay low until the Hargis family no longer cared where he was. It is our opinion that Peters came back after a couple of months to basically take the temperature of the area before he took off again. But the author of the article gives us a clue that Peters might be saying that he was going somewhere, but not really showing up there. These articles lets us know that the Hargis faction was still looking for him for retaliation. And Peters knew it. And he felt that it would be very prudent for him to simply leave the area than be killed himself. We were unable to find any records of Noah J. Peters other than a man going by that name that was from Lawrence County, Kentucky, who died in Ohio in 1936 at the age of 83 years old. If this was indeed the same Noah Peters, then he never returned to Breathitt County. Moments before the shooting. J.B. Little was called to the stand, sworn in, and began giving his testimony to the court. First, Little will talk about how long he knew Cockrill and Hargis. He will also talk about who he was standing with when he was having a conversation with Cockrill. Quote, the next witness was J.B. Little, who had known Cockrill since his lifetime, and also knew Jim Hargis and the men jointly indicted with him. Was talking to Cockrill just about 5 minutes before the shooting in front of the courthouse. Said King Ford was also talking to Cockrill and left him and entered the Hargis store, unquote. While Little was talking to Cockrill, he noticed movements of people around him. He was observant enough to notice the sour look that Britton threw towards Cockrill and that his actions seemed to be that of someone who had been drinking. Quote, witness said that he saw Elbert Hargis leave the store and go down the street just before the shooting. While witness was talking to Cockrill, Bill Britton came out of the store and walked past Cockrill and gave him an unfriendly look. Said that Britton looked as though he had been drinking and that Cockrill seemed to be very nervous as Britton passed by and looked at him. Britton entered the post office and asked for Hargis Brothers mail and returned to the store with some papers in his hand. Britton did not speak as he passed, but gave a sharp look at Cockrill, and the latter turned and followed Britton with his eyes until after Britton had left the post office and returned to the store. Unquote. Was Britton staggering in his walk? Did he reek of alcohol? Was his clothing and hair disheveled? Although the article does not tell us why Little thought that Britton had been drinking, it is interesting that Little brought this observation up during his testimony. Another interesting thing that Little said was that Cockrill looked nervous. If we go back to the Hargis Conspiracy feud story, it seems that Cockrill had been forewarned about the men wanting to kill him. Cockrill was told this by a woman that he had been dating, and he promised her that after he concluded his business with his attorney, that he would leave town. It seems that Cockrill never got that chance. The events of the shooting. Little continues his testimony with what happened during the time that Cockrill left his company to what he witnessed in the alley. Quote, witness said that Cockrill told him that he had some business to transact with attorney John Patrick, and they separated. Cockrill started up the stairway to Patrick's office, and Little went down the street to Davis' store on the corner just below. Just as Little entered the store, he heard shots and stepped out and saw Cockrill stagger into the alley. Little ran to where Cockrill had fallen and was followed by Will Jett and Elbert Hargis. He heard Hargis ask C.X. Bowling if Cockrill was dead, and being answered in the affirmative, he said to Jett, quote, let's go, unquote. Witness said Elbert Hargis seemed to be very nervous, unquote. Now, this testimony differs from others. According to Little, Cockrill was starting up the stairs to go to Attorney Patrick's office when the shooting began. According to other witnesses, Cockrill was crossing the street and caught in the crossfire. Also, that Cockrill was dodging bullets as best as he could to get to safety, but did not make it and died in the middle of the street. Other witnesses places the shooting of Cockrill in front of a store, and he was using the railings and columns as a shield. Still other witnesses claim that Cockrill was trying to make an arrest of several people inside of a store who were drunk. Could this be the reason why Little stressed the condition of Britain? That perhaps on the way to Attorney Patrick's office that he was going to stop and make arrests? Little places Cockrill dying in an alley. Could the street that is being described by the other witnesses be in fact an alley? Could Attorney Patrick's office be inside of the courthouse or inside of a store? It is not that we doubt the testimony of Little, but on the point of exactly where James Cockrill died seems to be a little confusing, and it seems that several sources each claim a different version of the actual events. This is the problem with witnesses. Each person sees things through the lens of their own perspective and experience. If the witnesses were not allowed to speak to each other in between the events and the trials, then we would have a more pure product of the truth. However, this trial took place 3 years later, and the witnesses had talked to each other. So it is up to you, our 13th juror, to determine which version seems the most plausible. Little talks about Jett and White. The trouble really begins for Little in what he does during the arrest and trial of Kurt Jett and Tom White. He was appointed as special eleaser to act as a sheriff in the arrest of the men. He would also testify in their trials. Quote, in answer to a question, Little said that he and Jim Hargis had been on friendly terms for 12 or 13 years prior to the trial of Curtis Jett at Cynthiana for the murder of Cockrill. Said he assisted in the arrest of Tom White and acted as special eleaser with his uncle C.J. Little during the trial of Jett and White for the murder of J.B. Markham. Was at Cynthiana as a Commonwealth witness during the trial of Curtis Jett for the murder of Cockrill, and after that trial returned to Jackson. Unquote. First, let's find out what a special eleaser is. The best definition that we could find would be used today under the California law. An eleaser is a person who is appointed by a court of law to perform a special function when a party refuses to cooperate. This is usually used in the case of an execution of a deed or a document. However, at that time, a special eleaser can be used to do the duties such as the arrest in the stead of a sheriff, coroner, or marshal. In this case, we have a dead marshal, a co-conspirator in the sheriff and judge. So there was a need for someone to step in their places to execute the warrants of arrest. So legally, Little had every standing to act in this capacity. He was also called to testify, which he did so. He claims that he was friendly with the family for many years before this came out. But this relationship would now turn for the worse, and Little would find out what it meant to be on the wrong side of the Hargis faction, and it was not a place you wanted to be. Trouble on a train ride. From his testimony, we can gather that even though Little had to arrest Jet and White, he really had no ill will toward the Hargis clan. He thought of it as simply doing the job that he was assigned to do. However, the Hargises did not feel this way and felt that Little should have refused. Little would not know what trouble he was in until the train ride. Quote, Little said that on the day the soldiers were recalled from Jackson by the governor, that he had business down the road and boarded the train and went to one of the stations near Jackson. On the same train were Jim Hargis and Doug Hayes, both of whom got off the train at Oakdale. Witness said on the return trip that afternoon, Hargis and Hayes got on the train at Oakdale and entered the rear coach and took a seat almost directly opposite him. Hargis carried a shotgun and seemed to have been drinking hard, and was more under the influence of liquor than Witness had ever seen him before. Witness supposed that they had been hunting and asked Hayes what luck they had. At this juncture, Hargis began cursing Little violently and threatened to shoot him for testifying against his relatives. Little said that he did not respond to anything he said, as he believed his time was about come, and he knew that to say anything at that time meant certain death. This abuse continued for a distance of several miles until the train reached Jackson. As Witness started to leave the train, he was followed by them, and just as he started to leave the platform, he was given a hard kick by Hargis. Little said that it was very dark when the train reached Jackson, and that he at once went to the hotel, where he told of this attempt of violence on the part of Hargis. Unquote. This would end the testimony given by Little. However, we do see a couple of things here. Hargis seemed to be under the influence of liquid courage on the return trip. Was this because Little was acting in a special capacity for the court? That Hargis needed the extra boost to confront Little? Hargis seems to have no trouble in confronting other people before this point. After all, he was a judge in his own right. But Little seems to be the second witness on the stand that either had to go to Hargis man-to-man or otherwise ran afoul of him. Another interesting thing that happens here is that Little was kicked in the dark before leaving the platform of the train station. Little points out that Hargis was the man guilty of this assault. While Little did turn in Hargis for doing this, it seems that no charges were brought against the man for his actions. S.S. Taulbee takes the stand. Evidently, there had been a question if Jet, Britton, and Spicer had been acting in an official capacity when the shooting of Cockrill had taken place. S.S. Taulbee would also bring with him the records to back up everything that he would be saying. Quote, S.S. Taulbee, County Clerk of Breathitt County, was the first witness in the afternoon session. Mr. Taulbee brought some of the records of his office, showing that Kurt Jett, Bill Britton, and Jesse Spicer had been appointed deputies under Sheriff Callahan. The witness turned to the records and to read to the jury where Jim Hargis, as county judge, had entered orders making the 3 men deputies in the sheriff's office. One of the orders in which Britton was reappointed being made after the death of Cockrill. This part of the testimony, however, was not allowed by the court, but it had gone to the jury before the objection was made. Unquote. So, the testimony concerning the installation of the men was objected to and sustained. Why would the defense object to these statements? Was it because this evidence would show that there was a political motivation behind the murder for hire? That the men were hired on with the sheriff's office to hide the fact that they were paid assassins? However, the jury had already heard the testimony before it was stopped. It will be interesting to see if the jury takes this evidence into consideration during their time in deliberations. Taulbee testifies to Hargis' threats. Evidently, Hargis was not a quiet person about his dislike of Town Marshal James Cockrill. Hargis would even go so far as to hire the best attorney in the state for the killer of Cockrill. Taulbee, like so many others, some of whom Taulbee would name, that heard such statements, but they thought that these were idle threats. They turned out to be very serious ones. Quote, following the introduction of the records, Taulbee gave some of the most sensational evidence against Hargis that has ever been introduced at a trial. Taulbee said that sometime in May or June, before the killing of Cockrill in July, he heard Jim Hargis say that he would engage the best lawyer in the state and stand by the men who would kill Cockrill. Witness said this remark was made in the presence of a number of people, but said he paid very little attention to it at the time. Said that County Attorney W. H. Blanton and perhaps Judge J. J. C. Bach were present when the remark was made. Unquote. There is a very old saying, quote, saying a thing is very different than actually doing a thing, unquote. And we are pretty sure that this was one of the reasons why everyone who heard Hargis make these threats didn't take it very seriously. Everyone knew that the judge of Breathitt County did not like Town Marshal Cockrill, but no one would guess that he was very serious about having his life ended. And not only did Hargis make these threats, he did so in front of fellow judges. These judges could be potential witnesses against him should anything happen to Cockrill, but Hargis loudly made those statements anyway. The timing of the statements. Timing is everything. Taulbee gives us the timing of when the threats against Cockrill had been made. Dr. Cox had already been eliminated in the mind of Hargis. His brother, Ben Hargis, had been killed in a shootout with Tom Cockrill in a bar. And for this action, Tom Cockrill was now sitting in a jail cell, awaiting the decision about his bail hearing. Quote, said it after the killing of Dr. Cox and Ben Hargis, and was made during a general conversation by the people about the killings in Breathitt County. Taulbee said that there was considerable excitement at the time in Jackson. Said that Tom Cockrill was in jail, and it was after the application for bail had been made by Tom Cockrill. Unquote. So, why did this timing matter? It shows that Judge Hargis was basically unhinged about the death of his brother. Also, during this time, there were people that were being questioned as to who killed Dr. Cox. And add to this was that the very guy that Hargis wanted to see in jail or executed was applying for bail before his trial. It was all too much for Judge Hargis to handle at that time. But you really have to hand it to Judge Hargis. If he did have a hand in the killings of Cox, Cockrill, and Markham, the best way to protect your paid hired hands would be to set them up in an official capacity. New office vacancy? This was the most astounding part of the testimony that we have come across so far. Judge Hargis announced that the office of Town Marshal was now vacant 1 week before Town Marshal James Cockrill was gunned down. Think about that for just a moment. Why would Hargis announce a vacancy if it was still filled? At this juncture, the Commonwealth asked Clerk Taulbee to read the order of Hargis as county judge made on July 14, 1902, 1 week before the death of Cockrill, in which he refused to accept the bond offered by Cockrill and declared the office of Town Marshal vacant. The defense objected to this evidence, but after a long wrangle and an examination of the record, it withdrew the objection, provided the court would permit the witness to read both records on the same page. This was agreed to, and the witness read the orders dismissing Kirk Jett as a deputy sheriff and the order declaring the marshalship of Jackson vacant. Witness was not allowed to read the order entered in June before, where Cockrill had executed bond, and was not permitted to show how much property was owned by the people who were on the bond of Jim Cockrill. Unquote. Now, Not only was the Taulbee testimony concerning that Hargis had posted a vacant seat that was still filled, but after the record of this action was read, under the wrangling of the court officers, we learned that Town Marshal Cockrill had previous bonds from people who owned properties. Why would this matter? Unless, as we learned earlier, that Spicer was wrapped up in a land scandal, and some of this land had been attached to some nefarious dealings. Could this be the reason behind the defense not wanting the court to have the records read into evidence? That all of this had to do with land and the coal company's bid to mine? Logan Gose takes the stand. To begin, we find out what Gose was doing shortly before the shooting of Town Marshal James Cockrill. Quote, Logan Gose, who was employed by Elbert Hargis at the farm at the time of the Cockrill shooting, was called. Said he was at work sunning hay that morning with Bill Britton, Abe McIntosh, and Will Griffey. Saw Elbert Hargis for the first time that day about dinner time. Unquote. So, it seems that if you were a hired hand for the Hargis faction, that you actually worked for them in some capacity. You didn't sit around twirling your pistols in the air to quell boredom. That is how hired assassins are often portrayed in the Saturday morning westerns after all. But here we have actual testimony that this simply was not so. The men worked on the farm or in the store more than they did anything else. As Gose's testimony goes forward, we will see that he did not actively participate in the plot to kill Cox, Cockrill, nor Markham. However, he did witness the events leading up to the murders from the perspective of someone who simply worked for the faction. Events at the dinner table. Now, something that is different about being in the mountains when it comes to mealtime. Dinner is what people from other places would usually call lunchtime. Supper is what people from other places usually call dinner time. This is important to establish, as it goes to the timing of when Gose witnessed the actions of Elbert Hargis and William Britton. Quote, Witness and the other hands went to the house for dinner about 11:30 o'clock, and said he heard Elbert Hargis say to Britton that he had worked for him in town that afternoon. And after dinner, Britton changed his clothes and started out toward town with Elbert Hargis, while witness and other hands went back to the field to work. That night he heard of the shooting of Cockrill. Unquote. I know that this seems like a very strange way to report the time today. However, clocks and watches were considered a luxury everywhere, and not everyone had one. Everyone usually went by the town clock, that is usually on the town clock tower. So, if you see o'clock, then they were reporting by an actual clock, and there was no guessing about it. As we can see, Gose was not invited to participate in the plot to kill Town Marshal James Cockrill. He was, however, a witness that Britton was told that he had work to do in town with Hargis, and he changed his clothes and left. It was not until evening hours that he was informed as to what happened to Cockrill. Cross-examination of Gose. Gose had testified in the William Britton trial. However, when we go back and take a look at the Britton trial, as reported in the newspapers, his testimony has been omitted. This simply could be that his testimony was not deemed as important information concerning William Britton. Quote, Witness was cross-examined by Attorney Hunt. Said he was sure that he had heard Elbert Hargis tell Britton he had worked for him in town that afternoon. This witness was introduced at the Britton trial and told exactly the same story, and was not shaken on cross-examination. Unquote. So, what we can take from this, that even though we could not find Gose's testimony being reported in the newspapers, that evidently there was a court record of him doing so. His testimony must have matched what he said in the first trial, as he could not be shaken from it. There was no deviation in the witness testimony. The testimonies of W. J. Cole, Carter, and Terry. The first three men to testify in this section of Breathitt County News would be Walker J. Cole, Marvin W. Carter, and Charles Terry would be recalled to the stand. Cole and Carter would testify as to what they witnessed while they were carrying on their daily business in the town of Jackson. Terry would be recalled to the stand to testify to the plot to kill Cockrill. The following is a direct quote from the Breathitt County News. Walker J. Cole, the special bailiff who arrested Ance White in Breathitt County and brought him into court after the first bailiff had failed to find him, testified. Cole is a merchant in Jackson and was en route to the depot when the shooting of Cockrill took place. Went on to the depot, and when he returned to town in about 20 minutes, he saw Jet, Britton, and Elbert Hargis at the courthouse. Marvin W. Carter, a barber at Jackson at the time Cockrill was shot, was the next witness. Was en route to his shop near the post office when the shooting occurred. Saw Cockrill and Bruce Little talking before the shooting began, and also saw Cockrill talking to Stewart Haggard just before the shooting. Witness saw Cockrill run down the street with blood gushing from his throat and heard him say twice, quote, "Boys, the courthouse window," unquote. Charles Terry was recalled by the Commonwealth to prove that Cockrill had told him of the alleged plot to kill him. Said Cockrill stated to him sometime before he was shot that Mose Feltner had told him, Cockrill, that the Hargises and Callahan had formed a plot to kill him, unquote. These three testimonies would end the court for Friday, but there would be more testimonies to come, and court was once again called into order on Saturday morning. The testimonies of Noble, Freeman, Strother, and Head. The next four men to testify in the murder case was Henry B. Noble, Henry Freeman, Charles Strother, and Joseph S. Head. Noble would testify as to the arsenal in Hargis's office on the second floor of the store and who was there before the death of Cockrill. Henry Freeman would testify to the relationship he had with the Hargis faction and what he was doing on the day of the shooting. Charles Strother and Joseph S. Head would testify to money transactions concerning Feltner. Quote, Henry B. Noble was put on the stand Saturday morning and told of the office on the second floor of the Hargis store and said he had frequently seen several guns and pistols in the office. Said he had seen Jet, Britton, Ashbury Spicer, Jesse Spicer, John Abner, John Smith, and Mose Feltner and Tom White in the store and office before the killing. Henry Freeman was next introduced, who said he was in Jackson the day Cockrill was shot, was driving a wagon at the time and had passed the courthouse some time before and saw four men in the window of the second floor, and blank, them to be the Hargis brothers and Callahan. Was not near the courthouse when the shots were fired and did not go back to find out who had been shot. Said his relations with the Hargises were friendly, and he had slept in the house of Jim Hargis and had taken breakfast with his family since swearing to the affidavits charging him with murder. Said he had slept with Elbert Hargis at the home of Jim Hargis and had also slept with him in the office of the store. Freeman said he had never talked to Jim Hargis about the affidavit. Was not allowed to say that Edwards had prepared the affidavit and asked him to sign it. Charles Strother, bookkeeper in Winchester Bank, and Joseph S. Head, cashier of Jackson Deposit Bank, were the next witnesses and testified concerning the money transactions between Jim Hargis and Felix Feltner. Unquote. While these testimonies may be a tad out of order, they were still necessary to back up the testimonies of other people who gave a more robust testimony to the events. The testimonies of W. N. Cope, Bowling, and Sherman Cope. The next three witnesses testified to a string of events. W. N. Cope would testify that Cockrill did not pull their guns until Callahan had his hand on his hip first. C.X. Bowling would testify that there was animosity between the Hargises and the Cockrills, and that Hargis would accuse Cockrill of attempted assassination. Sherman Cope would testify that he could not remember the events surrounding Moses Feltner and that he was not at home when the events of the shooting took place. Quote, W.N. Cope said he heard Jim Hargis say during the argument between Hargis and Cockrill that he was going to defend himself and defied Cockrill to touch him. Neither of the Cockrill boys had drawn any weapons until Callahan first put his hand on his hip pocket. C.X. Bowling said shortly after the trouble between Cockrill and Hargis, then the latter resented the attempt of the former to arrest him. Witness heard Hargis say to Callahan, quote, the low-down dirty dog had the nerve to walk in front of me after trying to assassinate me, unquote. Witness knew that Hargis was referring to Cockrill as he heard the name called by Hargis. He had just seen Cockrill pass down the street with a young lady. Sherman Cope, the next witness, knew Mose Feltner and was at the home of Jim Hargis in 1904 when French and Callahan were there. Went to see Mose Feltner in Leslie County and to get him to meet Hargis at the home of Callahan's brother-in-law. Feltner refused to meet and treat with him. Cope could not remember whether he took this message to Hargis, said Hargis was away on his return. The memory of the witness was faulty, and it was impossible for him to remember anything of importance. Said he spent several nights at the home of Jim Hargis when Feltner was there. Cope had been in Jackson the morning of the shooting, but had gone to Canal City and was not present when the shooting occurred, unquote. This would now conclude the testimonies that were given on Saturday during the trial. The following Monday, the court will once again convene. The testimonies of Felix Feltner and Smith. The last two witnesses for the Commonwealth of Kentucky would be Felix Feltner and Jeff Smith. Feltner would testify to the events concerning Mose Feltner. Jeff would testify to the events surrounding Hargis coming to him to hire him as an assassin. Quote, on Monday morning, Felix Feltner was introduced, who corroborated Mose Feltner in many important parts of his testimony. Jeff Smith, the last witness for the Commonwealth, testified that he was one of Callahan's deputies before Cockrill was assassinated. He was in the office of Jim Hargis one day when the latter said to him, quote, Jeff, Jim Cockrill will have to be killed, unquote. Witness said he replied, quote, Jim, how's that, unquote. Hargis then said, quote, well, Jim Cockrill will have to be killed, for if he is not, he will kill us, unquote. Witness answered, quote, I don't want to be in this, and I will have nothing to do with it, unquote. Hargis then said, declared the witness, quote, well, if you don't want to do it, I will get George Smith and Kurt Jett, and they will fix it, unquote. This testimony would end the Commonwealth case. Conclusion. A couple of things here before we move onward. Back then, it was not unusual for people to bunk together when they were hired on a farm. This is no way to be seen as the people involved had any personal relationship between them. It was just a matter of sharing a bunk to rest for the night. Another thing of interest is that Jeff Smith remembered the conversation between himself and Hargis that had taken place 3 years earlier. This had to be significant for Smith to remember it verbatim after the amount of time had passed. This concludes the testimonies that were given for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. In next week's video, we will start the case for the defense. What new information will be given by Judge James Hargis and other witnesses about what happened to Town Marshal Cockrill, and could they convince a jury that they were innocent of all the charges? Thank you. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian feuds. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube algorithm is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Be sure to double check that you are subscribed, as some of our viewers are finding that they are no longer subscribed to our channel. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.